On the morning of June 29, 1692, the iron-barred cell within Salem jail that had confined 9 accused women was discovered empty. The heavy oak door remained bolted from the outside. The single window was too slim for any grown woman to squeeze through. And the jailer, a man named Corwin, swore before God and the magistrates that he had not slept for even a single moment throughout that night. The 9 women had been slated to hang at dawn. By the time Reverend Nicholas Noyes arrived to offer them a final prayer, there was nothing left in the cell except 9 wooden spoons, arranged in a flawless row across the stone floor. Beside them lay a small heap of what the constable would later describe in a letter that disappeared from court records within a fortnight. Hair, freshly cut, damp, and still warm to the touch of a trembling hand. What transpired inside that cell between midnight and 5 in the morning has never been formally acknowledged by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The names of those 9 women were erased from the execution roster so thoroughly that most historians today believe they were never even charged. Yet in the basement of the Essex County Archive, inside a sealed box marked solely with a date and the word "incident," documents exist that tell a very different story. A story of land, of wealth, of 3 men in a cellar at midnight, and of a bargain struck by 9 desperate women that would bind their descendants in silence for more than 3 centuries. Before we continue with the tale of Salem's 9 women, if you appreciate dark American mysteries explored with the detail they merit, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit the notification bell. And let me know in the comments which state or country you are listening from tonight. Now, to grasp what occurred in that cell, we must return to the spring of that same year, to a village already devouring itself from within. Salem Village in 1692 was not the Salem that modern visitors picture. It was not a town of quaint wooden houses and cobblestone streets. It was a poor, wind-scarred farming parish of roughly 550 souls, set apart from the wealthier port of Salem town, with which it had been locked in legal and religious conflict for nearly 2 decades. The village sought independence. The town refused to grant it. The village wanted its own meeting house, its own minister, its own taxing authority. But the town decreed that Salem Village would remain a subordinate parish and would stay so. From that long, grinding bitterness emerged 2 factions. On one side stood the Putnam family and their allies, farmers of the western uplands whose fortunes had been slowly waning for a generation as Atlantic trade enriched the eastern merchants. On the other side stood the Porter family and their allies, tied by marriage and commerce to Salem town, to shipping, to the emerging economy rising from Boston and Marblehead. For nearly 20 years, these 2 factions had clashed over every pew assignment, every tax levy, every ministerial hiring, every disputed boundary line. By the winter of 1691, their mutual hatred had become the defining reality of village life. Children learned to cross the common by a particular path because the other route passed the home of a family whose name their father had forbidden them to utter. Women learned not to sit beside certain other women at meeting, for a generation of resentment rested between them on the bench. Men learned to carry a club when walking the roads after dark, not from fear of wolves or bears, though those still prowled the village edges, but from fear of their neighbors. That winter, in the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, 2 young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, began to exhibit what village physician William Griggs could only describe as the hand of the evil one. They convulsed on the kitchen floor. They spoke in voices not their own, deep voices, scraping voices, voices that seemed to come from behind their teeth, rather than from their throats. They complained of being pinched, pricked, and bitten by unseen hands. Marks appeared on their arms and legs, small red welts that no one had seen inflicted, and when pressed to name their tormentors, they named 3 women, all outsiders, all without male protectors in the village. A Barbadian slave named Tituba, held as property in the parsonage itself, a beggar named Sarah Good, known for foul speech and for smoking a pipe on neighbors' doorsteps, and a recluse named Sarah Osborne, who had married a much younger man after her first husband's death, and had been the subject of village gossip for a decade. Within weeks, the circle of accusers had expanded beyond those 2 girls to a company of 7, then 12, then more. Within months, it had consumed the entirety of Essex County. Respectable farm wives stood in the meeting house and fell to the floor, crying that a neighbor's specter was tormenting them from across the room. Children of 11 and 12 testified under oath to things they could not possibly have witnessed, and the magistrates, John Hathor and Jonathan Corwin, dispatched from Salem town to investigate, made a fateful decision in the first week of March. They decided the girls were telling the truth, and that the spectral evidence they offered, visions of the accused tormenting them in forms invisible to anyone else, would be accepted in the preliminary examinations. This was a decision without precedent in English common law. It would, within 6 months, put 150 people in chains, and it was a decision that, as certain men among the Putnam family quickly realized, could be steered. By the time the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer, convened in June 1692, under the authority of the new royal governor, Sir William Phipps, more than 150 people had been accused. The jails of Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge were overflowing. The Salem jail itself was not originally built for that purpose. It was a converted house on Prison Lane, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, with a cellar crudely reinforced with iron bars and a single oak door. The air in that cellar was said to be so foul in summer that the jailer's wife refused to bring the prisoners their meals, sending instead a serving girl of 14, who covered her face with a vinegar-soaked rag each time she descended the steep wooden steps. The cellar walls ran with moisture even in dry weather. The floor was packed earth for the first 3 feet, and then stone. The seam between the 2 was a breeding ground for rats, which no amount of poison or terrier work could fully control. Prisoners complained of being bitten in their sleep. Several older women developed sores that would not heal. The smell, according to a letter written that June by a visiting minister from Ipswich, was like nothing he had ever encountered. A compound of human waste, rotting straw, standing water, and something else, something sweeter and more private, which he could not identify and which, he wrote, he prayed never to encounter again. The women held there in June 1692 were chained by the ankle, not to each other, but to iron rings driven directly into the stone walls. This was not standard procedure. It was done at the specific written order of Magistrate Judge John Hathorne, who believed, and wrote openly in his letters to Cotton Mather in Boston, that witches could travel in spectral form through solid walls, if left unchained, and could afflict the godly even from within their place of confinement. Hathorne further ordered that the prisoners be searched upon entry into the cellar for what were called witch marks, meaning any unusual spot or protuberance on the body that might be used to nurse a familiar spirit. The searches were conducted by a party of respectable village matrons. The reports, preserved in the Essex County Court files, make for some of the most disturbing reading to survive from that season. Women in their 50s and 60s were stripped naked and examined in every fold and crease of their bodies by women they had known for 30 years. Women who had stood at their weddings. Women who had helped them bury their children. The searches took, on average, 2 hours. The searched women were returned to the cellar without their undergarments, which were retained as evidence. They sat on the stone floor in torn shifts, some weeping, some praying, some staring at the low ceiling in a silence that their fellow prisoners found more frightening than any tears. The 9 women in the cell on the night of June 28th were not, for the most part, the women whose names we recall today from the Salem trials. They were not Bridget Bishop, who had already been hanged on June 10th, the first condemned to die on Gallows Hill. They were not Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, or Sarah Wilds, who would hang together in a mass execution on the morning of July 19th. Their bodies left to swing from the oaks on Gallows Hill for most of the day before being cut down and thrown into the shallow crevice in the rock, ever since known as the Witch's Hole. The 9 women in that cell on the night of June 28th were, according to the surviving jail ledger, Mary Osgood of Andover, aged 55, wife of Captain John Osgood, a man of considerable standing in the militia. Hannah Carrier of Andover, aged 38, whose mother, Martha Carrier, would hang on August 19th, and whose own name would later be quietly struck from the records. Abigail Faulkner, daughter of a minister, aged 33, pregnant by several months and visibly so. Martha Emerson of Haverhill, aged 29. Sarah Cloyce of Salem Village, aged 51, sister of Rebecca Nurse, whose composure in court had been both remarked upon and feared. Mary Toothaker of Billerica, aged 40. Rebecca Eames of Boxford, aged 48. Deliverance Hobbs, whose age is given in the ledger as about 40, but who was closer to 35, a woman who had initially confessed to witchcraft and then recanted, making her the most hated of the accused among those who had not confessed, and a 9th name deliberately scratched from the ledger so thoroughly that the parchment beneath is worn through, as if someone had taken a knife to it in a state of great agitation and worked at it for some length of time, leaving only a pale oval where a name had once been written in a clear secretary hand. What these 9 women shared was not, as one might first suppose, poverty or marginal status. On the contrary, every one of them, with the possible exception of the 9th, was the wife or daughter of a landholder of considerable standing in northern Essex County, and every one came from a family that held contested title to property along the disputed boundary between Salem Village and Andover, a boundary that had been the subject of 3 separate surveys since the 1660s, none fully agreed upon by both parties, and every one of them had, in the weeks immediately before their arrest, either refused to sell their land to a Putnam agent, filed a petition of protest with the Essex County Court against the most recent survey, or both refused and filed. This pattern does not appear to have been noticed at the time. It would not be noticed for another century and a half. And when it was at last noticed, the man who noticed it would not live long enough to see his observation published. The event that would come to be called, in those few private letters that survived, the incident, took place on the night of June 28, 1692. It was a Tuesday. It had rained heavily in the afternoon, a summer storm rolling in off the Atlantic, and the roads leading into Salem Village were deep in mud by the time the sun began to set. The sun set that evening at around 8:27, and by 9, the last lamps had gone out in village windows. The last dogs had been called in from the yards. The air was heavy with the smell of wet grass and of the ocean 3 miles to the east, and the frogs in the marshes along the river were loud enough that a man walking the post road could hear them from a quarter-mile away. The jailer that summer was George Corwin, a cousin of the magistrate, appointed that spring after the previous jailer. A man named Bridget had died suddenly of what was officially recorded as a fever, but which had been, according to village gossip, a rather more complicated death. Corwin was 36, a man of modest intelligence and considerable ambition, married without children. That particular night, he was accompanied by 2 constables, Joseph Herrick, a man of 45 with a wife and 7 children, and a reputation for piety, and John Putnam the younger, aged 24, a nephew of Thomas Putnam. The 3 men had been drinking cider from a large stoneware jug delivered to the jail that afternoon by a serving boy from the tavern at the sign of the King's Head in Salem town. The jug was later found on its side in the jailer's room, most of its contents soaked into the floorboards. The wood beneath stained dark in a pattern roughly shaped like a hand. Neither the serving boy nor the tavern keeper could later remember who had ordered the jug, how it had come to be delivered, or who had paid for it. The records of the King's Head for that month, which ought to have shown the transaction, had been lost in what the tavern keeper described as a small fire in his ledger room. A fire that destroyed only the month of June, did not spread further, and which the tavern keeper himself had not witnessed, having been, he said, out of town at the time. At approximately 11 in the evening, according to Joseph Herrick's later deposition, the cider began to produce an effect unlike any cider the men had drunk before. It was not the effect of drunkenness. Corwin reported a heaviness in the limbs, a humming in the ears, and a strong desire to lie down upon the earthen floor. His hands, he said, felt as though wrapped in wet wool. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. When he tried to speak to Herrick, his words came slow and thick, as if spoken from under deep water, and Herrick had to lean close to make sense of them. Putnam the younger became ill and vomited twice into the back garden behind the jail, then sat down on the doorstep and wept for reasons he could not afterwards explain. He would say later that he had been thinking of his mother, who had died when he was 9, and that he had, for perhaps an hour, been unable to remember her face, and that this had filled him with a grief so sharp he could not bear to remain inside the building. Herrick, by his own account, remained conscious longer than the other 2, though he too felt the heaviness and the humming. He sat upright in his wooden chair against the jailer's room wall, clutching a Bible that had belonged to his father, and began to recite under his breath the 23rd Psalm, which he had memorized as a boy of 7. He recited it perhaps 20 times, and it was he who heard, at some point between midnight and 1 in the morning, what he described as a sound of women weeping. A quiet, continuous weeping that did not rise and fall as natural weeping does, but maintained a single low note, like a string being drawn across a viol. The sound came, he said, from directly beneath him from the cellar. And then, more disturbing than the weeping, a sound of women laughing. Not loud laughter, not hysterical laughter, but a quiet, companionable laughter, as at a small joke shared among friends who had known each other a long time. The kind of laughter that would follow a remark made in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary afternoon. And then, no sound at all. The silence, Herrick said, was worse than either the weeping or the laughter had been. He did not, he swore later, go down into the cellar. He did not hear the oak door open. He did not hear the bolt slide back. He did not hear footsteps on the cellar stairs. And this, as he would later confess on his deathbed, was the first lie of his later life. When the 3 men came fully to themselves, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, with the first gray light beginning to show in the eastern sky over village roofs, and the first birds calling in the elms around the jail, Corwin rose stiffly from the floor, where he had at some point lain down, took the keys from the peg in the jailer's room, and descended the narrow stairs to the cellar, to rouse the prisoners for the walk to Gallows Hill. The walk was perhaps a mile from the jail to the execution site, up a gentle rise of rocky ground past 2 farms, a small orchard, and along a stretch of pasture trampled by the feet of previous condemned and their spectators. Corwin had made the walk 8 times already that summer. He knew every stone in the road. He expected to make it a 9th time with 9 prisoners within the hour. He unlocked the heavy oak door of the cell. He found it as I have described. The ankle chains were not broken. They were unlocked and laid neatly on the stone floor beside the rings in the wall. The keys to those ankle chains hung, as always, on a peg in the jailer's room, 2 floors above, behind a door bolted from the inside. The 9 wooden spoons lay in a perfect row in the center of the floor, evenly spaced, their handles all pointing toward the door. The small pile of hair lay beside them. There was nothing else. No bodies, no torn clothing, no marks on the walls, no mud on the floor to suggest the women had been dragged out through any passage. The single high window, too narrow for even a small child to pass through, remained shuttered and barred. Corwin sat down on the stone floor of the cell and did not speak for nearly an hour. When he at last rose, he went upstairs, told Herrick and Putnam what he had found, and then the 3 stood in the jailer's room in silence for a long time before any dared to speak. It was Herrick who spoke first. What he said, according to Corwin's later private statement, was this: "We must agree now on what we saw before anyone else is told." In the decades that followed, Salem village tore itself apart over what had happened in 1692. The 9 women of the incident were absorbed into the larger horror of those months so completely that their names were rarely spoken aloud, except among the families themselves, and then not often even then. The parish records show that by 1697, 5 of the 9 families had relocated, 3 to Connecticut, 1 to the province of New York, and 1 to a settlement in what is now southern Maine. The 6th family, the Osgoods, remained in Andover, but ceased attending any organized church until the 1730s. When they did at last return to church attendance, it was to a church of a different denomination in a different town, under a minister who had no knowledge of the family's history. The 7th family, the Cloyses, continued to petition the General Court for restoration of property rights until 1699, at which point Peter Cloyes, Sarah's husband, died suddenly of what his physician described, in a phrase that would recur in this story, as a softening of the brain. After his death, no further petitions were filed by the Cloyes family. The 8th and 9th families cannot be traced at all. Remarkable in itself, because Essex County records of that period are otherwise thorough, and because the families in question had been in Massachusetts since the 1630s and left considerable documentary traces before the summer of 1692, and none afterwards. It is as if they had been erased, not forgotten, but actively erased. Their names removed from tax rolls, church rolls, militia lists, and deed records, leaving behind only the negative space of a family that ought to have been where no family now was. What did survive, however, is a series of letters between Reverend Increase Mather in Boston and a Salem town merchant named Philip English. English had himself been accused of witchcraft in April 1692, had escaped from Boston jail with his wife Mary by intervention of friends and payment of certain sums to certain jailers, and had fled to New York, from which he wrote in October of that year, asking Mather a single, carefully worded question. He asked whether Mather had any knowledge of a land transaction that had taken place in the final week of June 1692, involving 9 parcels of disputed property along the border of Salem village and Andover, and whether the signatures on the deeds of sale bore any resemblance to the marks used by the accused in their examinations before the magistrates. Mather's reply, if he wrote one, has not survived. English's original letter, however, is preserved in the papers of his descendants in New York, and it is specific in a way Mather would not have missed. English did not ask whether the accused had sold their land. He asked whether their marks on the deeds matched their marks on the accusations. A strange question to ask, unless one already suspected something about the condition of the women at the moment the deeds were signed. It suggests that English, sheltering in New York with his wife and a small fortune of his own, had received intelligence from someone in Essex County, whose name he could not commit to paper. It suggests that the mechanism of the incident, though not yet called by that name, was already suspected by a small number within 6 months of the night of June 28th. And it suggests that those people were, like English, either already fled from the colony or had good reason to wish they were. 3 months after English's letter was written, in January 1693, 9 parcels along that exact boundary were indeed transferred to new ownership. The new owners were, in every case, men connected by marriage or business to Thomas Putnam, one of the most active accusers in the Salem proceedings, a man who, in the space of 18 months, had made formal accusations against more than 40 neighbors, and whose handwriting appears on more complaint documents than any other individual. The original owners on the deeds, the 9 women of the incident, had signed with crosses rather than with their names, notable because several, including Mary Osgood and Abigail Faulkner, were demonstrably literate and had signed other documents in their own hand earlier that same year. Mary Osgood, for instance, had signed her name in a clear, careful hand on a parish subscription list for relief of the poor in March 1692, 3 months before her arrest. The Mary Osgood of the January 1693 deed signed only with a cross, and the crosses on the deeds, when compared by a suspicious clerk in the Essex Deeds Office, some 20 years later, matched in precise detail the crosses the same women had made on the accusation documents that had sent them to the cellar in the first place. Not approximately. Precisely, down to the angle of intersection and the slight hook at the end of the lower stroke. The clerk who made this observation, a man named Ebenezer Bowditch, died of a fall down the stairs of his own home within a week of making the report. His notes, drafted but not yet submitted, were never officially entered into the record. His widow, questioned afterward by a neighbor who had been her husband's friend, said only that in the days before his death, he had been unable to sleep, walking the rooms from midnight until dawn, murmuring about crosses and signatures and a cellar he had never himself seen. The widow did not remarry. She moved some months after the funeral to her sister's home in Newbury, and took with her, according to neighbors who helped her pack, only the clothes on her back in a small wooden box she would not allow anyone else to touch. If you are as disturbed by this as I am, take a moment now to hit the like button and let me know in the comments which part of the story has troubled you most. Your thoughts help more people find these forgotten histories. Every comment tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be seen. The investigation into what truly happened on the night of June 28th began in a quiet and unofficial way in the year 1710, when the General Court of Massachusetts passed an act reversing the attainders of many convicted in the Salem proceedings and granting financial restitution to their families. The families of the 9 women of the incident did not apply. This too was remarked upon at the time. A clerk named Samuel Sewall, who had himself served as one of the magistrates on the original court of Oyer and Terminer, and who in the year 1700 stood in silence in the Old South Meeting House in Boston while his pastor read aloud his public repentance for his role in the trials. Wrote in his personal diary that he had made inquiries and had been unable to locate a single living relative of any of the 9. This was on its face impossible. The Osgood family alone had at least 14 documented descendants living in Essex County in 1710. The Cloyses had direct relations in Salem village itself. The Faulkner line had branched into 3 separate households by the second decade of the new century. But when Sewall, acting on his own conscience and without official authority, traveled to Andover in the autumn of 1711 and presented himself at the Osgood homestead, he was received by a man who claimed the name Osgood, but refused to discuss Mary Osgood, his own mother, and asked Sewall to leave the property before the sun set below the hill west of the house. In his diary, Sewall wrote that the man's eyes had a quality he had seen only once before. In the eyes of a man who had survived the Deerfield massacre of 1704 and had watched his own 3 children killed before him. It was the look, Sewall wrote, of someone who had made a bargain he could not unmake and was forced to live each day under its weight, knowing that if he ever broke its terms, something he loved would be taken from him. Sewall made further inquiries over the following 2 years. He was a careful man whose public repentance for his role in the trials had been sincere and costly. He did not rest easily at the thought that there was some further wrong within the Salem matter, which he had never been told, and which he himself might have unknowingly facilitated as a magistrate. Through a contact in the Connecticut General Assembly at Hartford, he found that the families who had relocated to Connecticut had done so under new surnames, common enough among refugees from the trials, but that they had purchased new lands in cash amounts impossible for them to have saved from the farms left behind in Essex County. The Osgoods had held a farm worth perhaps £60 at the time of Mary Osgood's arrest. The family that arrived in East Hartford in the autumn of 1692 under a different name paid £215 in silver for a property there. The Faulkners had held even less. The family that arrived in Middletown paid nearly £300. The Cloyse descendants who relocated to a town on the Thames River in eastern Connecticut arrived with sufficient capital to start a small iron foundry, a venture requiring upfront investment far beyond what any Massachusetts farming family of their rank could reasonably possess. Through a correspondent in New York, he found that the one family that had gone south had also taken a new name, and that the head of that household, a cordwainer in Andover whose trade could not possibly support his family at the level the New York record suggested, had arrived in Manhattan with enough money to open a small import business, which by 1715 had become a large import business entangled through credit and shared ventures with several leading merchant houses, including certain houses connected with Putnam interests in Boston, and with men whose names Sewall did not commit to paper, but whose initials, written in his notebook margin in a careful hand, corresponded to 2 members of the Royal Governor's Council sitting in 1711, and he found at last, from an old, frightened woman in Salem village, who had once worked as a serving girl in the Putnam household, and was now in her final illness, having sent for a minister to ease her conscience, that on the morning of June 29, 1692, a covered cart had left the Putnam farm at approximately 5:30, heading west on the post road. The cart had been driven by Thomas Putnam himself. It had been accompanied by 2 riders. She could not see clearly in the dawn light, whose faces she had been warned that same morning not to attempt to remember. It had been loaded, she said, with 9 bundles that looked in the gray dawn light like folded laundry. But the bundles, she said, had breathed. She had watched from the kitchen window as the cart passed on the far side of the rail fence, and she had seen the canvas rising and falling, 9 separate rhythms, not quite in time with one another. She had turned away, set to kneading bread, and had not spoken of it to anyone, not even her husband, for 39 years. She had held it inside her, she told Sewall, for so long that when at last she spoke the words aloud, she could not be sure whether she was remembering the thing itself or the many times she had remembered it. But the bundles had breathed. Of that she was certain. Sewall noted in his diary at the end of this interview that the old woman had died 2 nights after speaking with him, in her own bed, of what the attending physician called a stoppage of the heart. The minister who had heard her final confession, the man who had brought her to Sewall, died 3 weeks later of a fall from his horse on a stretch of road he had ridden every week for 20 years. Sewall never published his findings. He could not, because the implications were too dangerous for the fragile peace restored to Essex County after the trials, and because the men implicated, though several were now dead, had powerful descendants still sitting in the general court, the pulpit, the magistracy, and the counting houses of Boston. He confined his investigation to a bound notebook of good calf leather, placed at some point in the 1720s inside a locked drawer in his personal library in Boston. He told his son, the 2nd Samuel Sewall, that the drawer's contents were not to be read by any living person, and that if the house ever passed out of the family, the drawer was to be emptied and its contents burned unopened. The 2nd Samuel Sewall kept this promise. The 3rd did as well. The notebook would not be opened again until 1843, when a great-great-grandson of the original, a young divinity student at Harvard named Jonathan Sewall Rogers, broke the lock in search of a particular sermon he had been told was kept there. A sermon by the original Samuel Sewall, on the text of the 90th Psalm, which the family believed preserved among his private papers. What Jonathan Sewall Rogers found instead was the notebook, and tucked between 2 pages dealing with the old man's inquiries into the incident, a single folded sheet of parchment that did not appear to be in Sewall's hand. The parchment was an affidavit signed by Constable Joseph Herrick in the year 1717, the year of his death. Herrick had dictated it. The affidavit stated, to a Wenham reverend named Joseph Garish, because he had been unable to die without confessing what he had seen on the night of June 28, 1692. He had come to the reverend on a Tuesday morning in February 1717, a man of 70 by then, his body thin and shaking with what he called a sickness of his bones, and had asked to dictate a confession on condition it not be read to anyone until after his death. Reverend Garish, recognizing the man was not long for this world, had agreed. Herrick wrote, or rather, Reverend Garish wrote for him, that he had not in fact remained in the jailer's room that night. He had gone down the cellar stairs at some point after midnight, drawn by the sound of weeping, and then by the laughter. He had done so against Corwin's specific instructions and against what remained of his own judgment. He had moved in his stocking feet, without boots, to make no sound on the wooden steps. He carried no light. He held his father's Bible in his right hand as a talisman and shield. The oak door of the cell had been unbolted when he reached the bottom of the stairs. It stood slightly ajar, and a faint light, the color of candlelight, but steadier than any candle he had ever seen, came from inside. The chains on the ankles of the 9 women had been unlocked and neatly coiled on the stone floor. Standing inside the cell were 3 men he recognized. One was Thomas Putnam. He stood near the door with a small lantern in his hand, the kind used in barns and outbuildings, looking at the 9 women with what Herrick described as the expression of a man counting sheep before a sale. He nodded once to someone out of Herrick's line of sight. One was the village constable's superior, a man he declined to name in the affidavit, describing him only as a figure of high office in Essex County, whose voice Herrick recognized from having heard it pronounce sentence in the courthouse not many days before. The man stood slightly behind Putnam, with clasped hands, wearing the coat he had worn on the bench. He had not troubled to change his clothing for this work. Herrick's refusal to name this man is the most commented upon feature of the affidavit in the 2 surviving transcriptions, and has been subject to several scholarly conjectures, none yet proven. The list of men holding high office in Essex County in June 1692 who could have been present at that hour is not long, perhaps 6 names. 5 are still honored in the naming of streets, schools, charitable foundations. The 6th has been largely forgotten, and is the name most researchers considering the question have privately settled upon, though none has yet been willing to publish the conclusion. And one was a man Herrick had never seen before, a man in a dark travel cloak, whose face Herrick could not, even on his deathbed under the weight of his coming judgment, quite bring himself to describe, except to say that the man carried a leather satchel about the size of a small traveling bag, and that the leather satchel was moving. It moved in a slow, regular rhythm, as if something inside were breathing. But the rhythm was not quite the rhythm of breath. It had pauses where no lung would pause, quickenings where no lung would quicken. The man in the cloak held the satchel at his side, as if he had been carrying it for a very long time, and had grown used to its movement. The women in the cell, Herrick wrote, sat in a row on the stone floor, not speaking, not weeping, not moving. Their wrists had been bound one to the next with lengths of ordinary rope, which made no sound when the man in the cloak gestured for them to rise. Their feet were bare. Their eyes were open, and each one of them, Herrick wrote, was looking directly at him. Not one, all of them, at the same moment, as if all 9 had known before he knew it himself that he was there at the foot of the stairs. He fled back up without a sound, his heart beating so loud in his ears, he was certain it would betray him. He lay on the floor of the jailer's room beside the snoring Corwin and weeping Putnam the younger, pretending to sleep. He heard, some immeasurable time later, the sound of the oak cell door closing, the bolt sliding into place from outside, footsteps on the cellar stairs, the outside jail door opening, and a cart creaking on the muddy track beyond the building. And then nothing. He did not sleep again that night. He lay with open eyes, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. He made himself a promise never to speak of what he had seen, and kept that promise for 25 years. It had cost him, he said, his health, his peace, and the affection of his wife, who had known from the first week of July 1692 that something had happened in the jail. Her husband could not tell her, and had withdrawn from him by small degrees over 25 years into her own silence. The affidavit Rogers found in 1843 did not remain in his possession long. Within 6 months of discovery, he had written to 3 scholars of New England history, enclosing a careful transcription of Herrick's words. Within a year of sending those letters, all 4 men, Rogers and his 3 correspondents, were dead. Rogers drowned in the Charles River on a November evening in 1844, officially ruled a suicide, though there were no witnesses, and the body bore bruises on the wrists and back of the neck, which the coroner attributed to the river's current. One scholar, George Bancroft, died of a fever contracted on a voyage to investigate parish records in Andover, a voyage undertaken specifically in response to Rogers' letter. Another, a clergyman named Peter Thatcher, was found at the foot of his own church bell tower in Boston on a Sunday morning. The church closed since the previous evening, and the bell tower staircase door still locked from the inside. The third, a lawyer named Ephraim Peabody, died of what his attending physician recorded, using the exact phrase used for Peter Cloyce in 1699 and for Ebenezer Bowditch years later, as a softening of the brain. He had become, in his final weeks, unable to speak. His wife reported that he would sit by the fire in the evenings, staring into it, and sometimes beginning to weep. When she asked what was wrong, he would lift his hand to show her a small mark on the underside of his wrist that had appeared months before, resembling nothing so much as the impression of a cross, which she had first taken for a bruise, but which had not faded with weeks or months, and seemed on some evenings darker than others, never in any pattern she could discern. The original Sewall notebook was returned to the family papers and deposited in 1879 with the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it remains today, available for any scholar to request. But Herrick's affidavit, the most damning document in the notebook, was not deposited with it. Its current location is unknown. The two surviving transcriptions, made by Rogers before sending his letters, are held in private collections, viewed by a handful of researchers who have each, for reasons not always documented, chosen not to publish their findings. What does survive in the Essex County Archive is the sealed box mentioned at the beginning of this story, labeled with the date June 29, 1692, and the single word incident. The box was opened once in 1922 by a young archivist named Edith Pierce, cataloging the county's 17th century holdings in a project funded by a private Boston foundation. Pierce's catalog entry, the only surviving description by a qualified professional, is as follows: 9 parchment sheets, each bearing a single cross in the lower right corner, otherwise blank. The crosses, Pierce noted, were identical in form and resembled marks made by the accused on Salem complaint documents preserved elsewhere in the archive. 1 iron ankle ring, the lock partially melted as if by great heat, the iron itself showing the peculiar crystalline structure formed when metal is heated to just below its melting point and cooled rapidly. A phenomenon Pierce noted she could not account for, as the Salem jail cellar had no heat source sufficient to produce such an effect, the building being unheated in June and in any case not equipped for metalworking. 1 small pile of human hair, dark, shoulder length, braided into 9 small plates, each bound at the top with what appeared to be a thin strip of the same hair, intricately plaited back upon itself. The hair showed no sign of decay after more than 2 centuries, and was noted by the county physician who examined it at her request to have the appearance of hair cut from a living head rather than a corpse, a distinction. The physician explained in a private letter, not easy to articulate in precise scientific terms, but which any practiced embalmer would immediately recognize. 1 small leather pouch containing 9 wooden spoons, each carved from the same piece of wood, each marked on the handle with a letter of the alphabet. The letters, Pierce noted, did not spell an English word, but did spell a series. A colleague in the Harvard Divinity School, a scholar of medieval liturgy, identified in a letter dated September 1922 as an acronym in Latin of a phrase used in a particular ritual of the medieval Roman Church for anointing the dying. The phrase translated into English was, "Let them go in peace." 3 weeks after that letter was received, Edith Pierce resigned her position at the Essex County Archive, packed her personal belongings into 2 trunks, and returned to her family home in rural Vermont, where she lived another 41 years and, according to her nephew, who inherited her papers after her death in 1963, never again spoke of her work in Massachusetts. leaving the room if the word Salem was mentioned in her hearing. The nephew, interviewed once in 1984 for a local historical society newsletter, said only that his aunt had kept until her death a small wooden box on the mantel above her fireplace, and that he had been told as a child never to open it. When he inherited her house, out of respect for her wishes, he placed the box unopened in her coffin before burial. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Salem intensifies. If this story gives you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because there is one more document, and it is perhaps the most disturbing of all. Its discovery is recent enough that some involved are still living, and some are still afraid. In the spring of 2007, a family in East Hartford, Connecticut, was clearing the attic of a house that had been in their family for 9 generations. The house had been purchased, according to East Hartford town records, in the autumn of 1693, by a couple who had arrived from Massachusetts with, according to local tradition, no prior history and considerable silver. The couple had given their names as Thomas and Mary Barker, telling neighbors they had married in Boston and decided to start afresh in Connecticut, after a loss they preferred not to discuss. They paid £215 in silver for the house and 50 acres. They lived quietly for the rest of their lives, had 4 children, and were known as gentle, reserved, and devout in a modest way. Never quite at ease in the meeting house, never absent from it, generous in small matters, private in large ones. And they had, according to Mary Barker's will drawn up in 1729 and preserved in Hartford probate records, left their eldest daughter a cedar chest, not to be opened in her lifetime, nor in the lifetime of any person who had known the testator, but to be preserved within the family as long as it should endure, as a remembrance of a time of great trouble from which she had been delivered by God's mercy and a friend's charity. A friend whose name she could not write. The cedar chest had passed down through 9 generations, opened at various points for additional items. By 2007, it contained, besides original contents, a Civil War pension certificate, love letters from the 1920s, a christening gown from the 1950s, and a folded wedding dress from the 1980s. Beneath all, at the bottom, wrapped in what appeared to be a linen shift of extreme age, was a small bound volume, approximately the size of a modern paperback, whose cover appeared to be aged brown leather, but on closer inspection by a Binet library conservator at Yale, to whom the family brought it for authentication, was determined to be something other than leather. The conservator's private report, shared with the family but not published, concluded only that the material was organic in origin, not the skin of any commonly available animal, and showed structural characteristics consistent with human dermis tanned using methods known in late 17th century New England. The volume's pages were filled with small, careful handwriting in a form of English dated by a Yale linguist to the last decade of the 17th century, consistent with a literate woman born in the 1630s. The volume was a diary, kept, according to the opening page, by a woman whose name was written in full in her own hand, Mary Osgood. Beginning on July 1st, 1692, 2 days after she had disappeared from Salem jail, 3 days after she was scheduled to hang. The diary was not long, covering about 11 months to May 1693. It described in careful, sometimes beautiful prose the life of a woman, starting anew in a new place with a new name, with a husband she had married by arrangement some 6 weeks after arriving in Connecticut. A widower named Thomas Barker, whose first wife had died in childbed, told only that his new wife was a respectable Massachusetts woman who had suffered a terrible loss. and a community that asked no questions, because the man in the dark travel cloak had, she wrote, sent word ahead that certain newcomers that autumn were not to be inquired after. The diary described daily work, the long Connecticut winter of 1692, the slow return of something like peace. She wrote of learning to love her new husband, a man who never asked about the name she no longer used and accepted with quiet patience. More moving than any declaration of love, that his wife sometimes woke weeping in the night and could not tell him why. She wrote of cooking, spinning, the small church at the lane's end, the neighbor who brought apples, and asked only whether she preferred them baked or fresh. She described the other 8 women, settled within a day's ride across the Connecticut River Valley, seen in small gatherings over that year. They met in kitchens under pretext of visiting and spoke of ordinary things. Never speaking of the cellar, the oak door, the cart on the track, or the 9 chains unlocked without a key. Once, Mary wrote in February 1693, she and Sarah, whom she does not further identify but can only be Sarah Cloyce, sat together by a fire in a Wethersfield farmhouse and wept for a full hour without speaking. Then dried their tears and spoke only of that year's butter. They did not look at each other while weeping. They did not embrace. They sat on either side of the hearth, stared into the fire, and allowed themselves that 1 hour to grieve for what they could not name. Then they stopped at the same moment, as if by prior agreement, and went on with the visit. And the diary described once, only once, in an entry dated November 10, 1692, the man in the dark travel cloak and the terms he had offered them in the cell. He had come to them, Mary wrote, on the night of the 28th through the unlocked cell door, accompanied by Thomas Putnam and by a man she called the High Gentleman, whom she too declined to name, whose identity she had been warned never to discover, because to know it would be to be unable to forget it. And forgetting, she wrote, was the first duty she had been asked to perform. The man in the cloak explained their release terms with great gentleness, in a voice Mary described as that of a very old man, though he did not seem old in his movements. He addressed each by baptismal name, not the name by which they had been accused. He gave each the choice individually, and in turns he stay in the cell and hang at dawn, or go with him and never speak, under any circumstance for as long as they lived, of what happened in that cell, who they once were, the village left behind, their husbands, their children, or any person who had known them by their true name. Their silence was required, not for the protection of the men who arranged their release, though that was one consequence, but because the true purpose of the Salem proceedings, he said, was not hanging witches. Hanging witches was the public face, the face that would be remembered, written into histories, pamphlets, and sermons of repentance. The true purpose was the transfer of approximately 4,000 acres of disputed farmland from families holding it for 2 or 3 generations to families who would put it to a different use. A use he did not fully specify, but which required, he said, the land be understood as spoiled, cursed, ground upon which no prudent man would wish to build. The hangings attached permanent stigma. To accused families, no one would contest title to land whose previous owner had been hanged for witchcraft. No descendant would claim an inheritance tainted by that shame. The disappearances made it possible to remove certain families too well connected, respected, sympathetically regarded to be hanged without endangering the enterprise. For them, hanging would produce martyrs, martyrs' inquiries, inquiries' truth. For those families, erasure not death, absence not a body on the gallows, a cell one morning empty. Hangings were a theatrical necessity, disappearances a practical mercy. And disappearances would continue as long as required. Land would change hands as long as required, and true history would not be written down. Because those who would write it were those arranging it, and because its hidden victims would themselves be alive, grateful, and silent. Each received a new name, a new husband, a new home in a town chosen for distance from any Essex County traveler, a sum sufficient to establish a new household and guarantee of her life and her children's lives to come. In exchange, she gave her silence, and the silence of every descendant she should ever have, for as long as her blood continued. If she spoke, if at any point she spoke of the cell, the cloak, or the bargain would be broken and a price collected. He did not specify the price. He did not need to. Each woman had in that moment a clear and precise understanding of what could be taken from her. It is the particular cruelty of such arrangements, Mary Osgood wrote, that they do not require the threat to be spoken. It is made by the mind of the person bearing it, shaped exactly to the fear she carries most deeply. There is no negotiating with a threat one has oneself assembled. Mary Osgood closed the November 10th diary entry with a single sentence. The only sentence in the entire volume in which she permitted herself to sound afraid. I do not know what became of the 9th woman among us. She did not come with us to Connecticut. She did not come with us at all, and when I asked the man in the cloak where she had gone, he did not answer me, but I saw his face move. The remainder of the diary, from November 11th, 1692 to the final entry in May 1693, contains no further reference to the cloak, the cell, the 9 women, or the 9th. Only the small chronicle of a woman trying, with some success, to make a life out of silence. The final entry reads in its entirety, I have planted the garden today. Thomas has built a new gate. The apple trees are in flower. I believe I am with child. May God forgive us all. The Osgood diary is currently in the private collection of the family that found it. They have declined since initial authentication in 2007 to make it available to scholars, citing wishes of an elderly family member who was in her 90s at the time and has since passed away. The family has declined since her passing to revisit the decision. A partial transcription made by the Yale conservator during the brief authentication period exists in limited academic circulation and has been the subject of 2 doctoral dissertations, both quietly withdrawn before publication. One by a Boston University student, one by a Philadelphia seminary student. The names are a matter of record for those searching dissertation registries from those years. Both are still living, both have moved to fields unrelated to their original subjects, and neither will return calls on Salem, the Osgood diary, or what the man in the cloak meant when he said the land would be put to a different use. The Essex County Archive still holds the sealed box, still labeled Incident, its contents according to a phone call I made in preparing this story to the present day archivist, are still exactly as Edith Pierce described in 1922, down to the 9 parchment sheets, the iron ankle ring with partially melted lock, and the 9 small plates of hair which, according to a recent privately funded examination, still show no sign of decay more than 330 years after they were cut. The 9 parcels along the Salem village and over border changed hands many times over 3 centuries. They are today, in whole or part, sites of a regional shopping mall, a private school, 2 cemeteries, 1 closed to new interments, a stretch of state highway, and a small industrial park with 3 separate owners over the years, each selling within 5 years of acquisition. None is regarded in local tradition as haunted, none has been subject to unusual report, no ghost story attaches to them, no historical marker indicates what happened on them. The land, as the man in the cloak is said to have promised, has done what was required and been forgotten. that forgetting is perhaps the most thorough thing about the entire affair. What this story shows us, perhaps, is that the most terrifying thing about Salem was not what we were told. Not the accuser's hysteria, the judge's cruelty, or a frightened colonial village huddled against the dark forest. The most terrifying thing was that beneath the visible horror lay a second horror. Quieter, more patient, more interested in property than souls, that has never been prosecuted, named, fully acknowledged, or, so far as we can tell, gone away. Every generation since the Osgoods boarded that cart in the dawn of June 29th, 1692, has produced its own men in dark travel cloaks. Quiet transfers of land, families learning, as Mary Osgood's descendants learned, that certain questions are not to be asked, certain names not to be spoken, and certain cedar chests not to be opened. Not in your lifetime, nor the lifetime of any person who might remember. And perhaps somewhere there is a ninth woman still, or the memory of one, in a satchel that still moves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Do you think the ninth woman ever truly left that cellar? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.